Well, everybody's here. The door's closed. Everybody, I am so happy to see everybody today. I love starting on time. This is great. So, welcome everybody. Let's pray first, and then we can get into this. Father, thank you so much that you've given us the opportunity to learn this. Father, I just pray that you would give people the desire to continue to learn your Old Testament, Father, because you're the same God as the God of the New Testament. And we just thank you for that. And also, you're the same God 2,000 years later with us. Father, we just ask you, please bless us and help us to understand it. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, welcome. So, we only got a couple classes left. And I wanted to first recommend to everybody that all of my PowerPoints I've made available to everybody. And I write my PowerPoints so that you can study from them. And actually, that's what I do in class, is I have my students study from my PowerPoints. Because I put a lot of information on them, I put all the verses and everything. So if you just go through the PowerPoints by themselves, you're going to learn something. So whenever part of the Old Testament you're going to go into, I recommend that get one of my PowerPoints. And this, how you get them is, first you can either text me and I'll send them to you. Or you can go to the church website. They have them. They also have them on YouTube. If you want to actually watch the video, you can go in and do that. But that brings me to the point I want to thank somebody, Robbie, the man. I want to thank Robbie because Robbie, I email these things to him every week, and he just puts them in there. He sets them online. He puts them in YouTube. You know, in C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, he talked about some lady in the middle of the city that no one knows about. But when she goes to heaven, God is just praising her because she did all these things, and people were like, well, I've never heard of her before. But that was the idea. You do all these things because no one's ever heard of you, but God remembers. And so that's Robbie, and I want to always thank him for that. I appreciate you a lot, man. So, today this is going to be the last of the Old Testament series. Now, next week we've got some review and stuff to go through, and then what we're going to do, and we're going to have a week off, and thanks to the elders who allowed us to do this, but we are going to have 3 weeks of the intertestamental period. I was hoping for 1. They gave me 3. So you know what that means. The good news is I actually have a lot of good stuff. And what I'm going to do, now I taught this actually, the intertestamental, before it here about a year ago, and everybody loved it. But I've really added to it. And my whole goal is this. If you want to understand the New Testament, come to the intertestamental series. Because we will go over so much stuff on the New Testament. Whenever you read in the New Testament, you will now understand, why did Jesus deal with the Pharisees and Sadducees the way he did? Why did they do what they did? That's interesting. I've got a whole things to talk about that. Why is everything in Greek when we get to the New Testament? What about tax? I'm even going to go into tax collectors, where they came from. Simon the Zealot, where he came from. We're going to go into Hanukkah. We're going to go into the Apocrypha. We're going to go into all these different things that will lead us up into the New Testament. So whatever you read then, you'll be like, oh yeah, I get that. Oh yeah, those guys, I know who those guys are. I'm telling you, it's amazing. And so you would be surprised how much information's out there about that. So please come. Now, we're not going to be in here during that. We're going to actually be in the classroom. So please, not in 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, the second week of February, please join me in the classroom because I would love the more the better. All right, so let's talk about this. Now, what I did, this is a little bit different, the way I'm going to do this, because the thing about this information is it's really hard to find. It's like you'll read it and you really won't understand it, because one of the problems is, for instance, Ezra jumps around a lot. He doesn't really go into this, he doesn't go into there. He maybe go here, and all of a sudden he'll be talking, and all of a sudden he'll talk about something 80 years down the line. And you'll be like, what the heck? And then all of a sudden, you're like reading that, and all of a sudden, you're right back to where he was before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to help you guys to understand Ezra and Nehemiah. We're going to go over the guys who are around this time frame. We're going to talk about Zechariah, Haggai, Malachi, all those guys, and we got a bunch of kings to go through. So also, this information here, it's kind of hard to find all the information because the Bible doesn't have all of it in a really good form to understand history. So what I did is we're going to go through to a guy named Josephus. You may have heard of him. He was a Jewish historian at the time of Jesus, and he wrote this stuff in great detail. So I'm not going to tell you, do I 100% trust Josephus? No, not really, but, I think it's some good information, and it's going to fill some gaps so that you'll understand kind of what happened. And I think you'll like it as we go through here. So, let's get going. Now, will no one rid me of this troublesome priest? Yes, King Henry II of England. He said that, and that was a very bad idea. He was the king, and the Archbishop of Canterbury basically was the head guy of the Church of England at that time, and those two just didn't get along. They were actually best friends, and they turned away from each other, and he made a fateful statement. It said, will no one rid me of him? Well, if anybody know the history of that one? He dies. Not by king, but by the king's men right in front of the altar in church. They killed him, right there. And just like the picture shows. And the thing is, it made Henry's life very bad because he didn't want him to die. But the same way is this. Judah found themselves, just kind of like England did here, because the problem is during this time is England was under the Roman rule of the church. We'll get to that during church history. But in the same way, Judah is going to find themselves for the next 600 years under the rule of somebody else. Save about 30 or probably about 40, maybe 50 years of those 600 did they ever live on their own. They were always under the rulers. And I'll tell you, what we're going to do is when we start the intertestamental period, we are going to go through Daniel 11 and 12 and actually learn the history that was spoken of hundreds of years before it happened. God laid the history down in Daniel 11 and 12. We're going to go through that first when we get to that point and go through it. Because Judah was trying to serve God. Now, remember, they were taken away because they had infidelity. They served multiple religions, synchronistic. And so now God's going to bring them back. But unfortunately, they have to live under these rulers. So, one of the things we're going to talk about, it's kind of hard to learn Nehemiah and Ezra. By the way, where is Ezra and Nehemiah located in the Bible? Anybody? Well, that's true. We know. Well, yeah, that's a given. That's a given. Where in the Old Testament are they written? Are they in the prophets? Are they in the history? Are they in the Psalms? Where are they at? Historical books. Yes, they're the last two of the historicals. They're going to be right after Chronicles, because Chronicles is going to stop, and Ezra and Nehemiah will pick up from that point. So yeah, they're there in the middle of there. So which kind of a lot of Christians have a hard time with that, because if you don't understand how the Bible's put together, you're not going to really understand. You're going to read them, and you're going to be going through all this history, and then you go right to the prophets and think that, well, there's more history. But the history is only those books. Okay? The prophets will be mixed in with them, but they separated them for a reason. So we're going to look to Mr. Flavius Josephus. Now remember Tiglath-Pileser, the beer guy? All right. Well, this is the coffee guy. This is the coffee guy. Flavius Josephus, the great taste of coffee. So. All right. Before we get there, let's learn about we've got Postexile and the Diaspora. First of all, Diaspora means dispersion. So when Judah was able to return to their homeland, God wanted them to build a temple. But what God did, though, is he dispersed them. Let me tell you guys, this is, if you don't understand nothing else, understand the diaspora, the dispersion. I'll give you why in just a minute. Ezekiel says, now remember, Ezekiel was actually one of the two prophets who went to Babylon in about 597, I remember. With uplifted hand I swore to them in the wilderness that I would disperse them among the nations. Said it before, it's going to happen. Scatter them throughout the countries because they did not obey my laws, desecrated my Sabbaths, and so forth. Okay? Now, let me tell you, that is a picture, that map right there actually is the picture of around the time of the Romans, around the time of Jesus. That's where all the Jews were at that time. Okay? The diaspora led to Christianity. That is the most important thing. This whole thing laid the foundation for Christianity. If they had not been dispersed, Christianity would have never succeeded. Because think about it. Where did Christianity start? Where did it start? Judah. If it had nowhere to go, because they were, remember, all Christians in the beginning were Jews. Every one of them were Jews. Well, maybe a couple here and there, but for the most part, they were Jews. So how do you think it's going to spread? Well, if there's Jews all over the place now, everywhere, it's going to spread. If they were only in Judah and never left Judah, it would have never spread. God knew what he was doing, and he made it happen. This would help Christianity because Rome at the time was favorable towards the Jews. We'll get into that, which is another blessing, because Rome did not like other religions whatsoever. They didn't like them, but they respected Judaism because it was an ancient religion. We'll get into that during the intertestamental period. Let's begin. Remember Jeremiah's 70-year prophecy. So Jeremiah basically said that God is going to take all your people and we're going to send you away, okay, for 70 years. And it was pretty much 70 years. Because we know the first people that left was in 605. And then they came back in about 638. So was it 70? No, it's like 67. But that's pretty close. One of the things I found with the New Testament, see, this is where we have a problem with today, is that we're very succinct. I mean, I was trained in the scientific theory. I was trained, very, very, this equals this, which equals this, which equals this, and everything adds up and got to be perfect. You got to remember, they didn't think that way back then. Everything was not so perfect. They used round numbers quite often. And so 70 years was about 70 years. And it's okay because that's just what they did. We got to remember we're not like them. They weren't worried about it back then. All right, let's see what Ezra and Chronicles say. Now, I didn't write Chronicles up here because Ezra, we believe, wrote Chronicles, and the very last couple verses of Chronicles almost speak verbatim of what Ezra. So literally, you're reading Chronicles, and you read it, then again, you're going to stop, you're going to move to Ezra, because my Bible just keeps going, scroll and pull down. You're going to go to Ezra and read the exact same thing. In the first year, King Cyrus of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved on the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation, putting in writing that any people may go up to Jerusalem and Judah, build a temple, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them. This is from Ezra. So basically, he went and said, hey, you guys can go back. What do you guys remember which prophet prophesied that this was going to happen 140 years before it happened? Which one did it? Isaiah. In Isaiah spoke, actually named Cyrus by name. He said this dude Cyrus is going to come and save everybody. He wrote it 140 years before it happened. See, this is our God. We have a God that speaks to us. We have a God that communicates. We have the God that shows us things before it happens. Our God is awesome. So let's talk about the Persians. Who were they? Now, that is the Persian Empire. And so far to date, it's the biggest empire. Remember what I said. Before the Assyrians, they had like 600 years between the dominance of the Egyptians that Israel was able to grow. Then he went through the Assyrians. Then they went through the Babylonians. And now they're in the Persians. Now the Persians were actually just they just thought things a lot differently than the Babylonians and Assyrians did. Babylonians and Assyrians want to kill you, destroy you, tear your flesh up, put you on posts, take your flesh and throw it over the top of their walls. They want to do all kinds of bad things to you. These guys did not. Now, the interesting thing also about these guys is the guy who's going to replace these guys in a couple hundred years is going to learn from them. So for the most part, Judah is going to be safe now for the next 300 years. Because God provided people that are going to allow them to continue on in their worship. Which is unusual because most of the time, as we saw for the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they wanted them to stop. So the Persians were not like that. And the guys who's going to replace them, I'm not going to tell you who they are, but the guys who are going to replace them are going to be the same way towards them. Very kind. The Medes. I'm only throwing this in here because you read in Daniel about the Medes and the Babylonians and the Persians. Well, the Medes were these guys, and if you see up there, see Media, it's actually Persia. Media is like the middle there. They basically played both sides, because you'll find in the Bible that they actually supported Babylon. And then all of a sudden you hear that the Medes and the Persians are going after Babylon. So they played both sides. They were kind of a small group. Not a lot's really known because they didn't leave a lot of historical record, but northern Iran. All right, here are the kings we need to learn because these kings are in the Bible. And these guys, we will see that everything during this teaching has to do with these guys. All but one are good guys, which is unusual. Most of the kings are usually turned out to be bad guys, but only one of these guys are going to be a good guy. All but one. All right. Cyrus the Great and Cambyses the Second. Cyrus was called the Great because the Jews named him that. He didn't call himself that. I'm sure he thought he was great, but, the Jews call him the Great because they allowed them to return. Now, you got to understand, not only did he allow them to return, he gave them money to go back with. I mean, this guy treated them very well. Cambyses, unfortunately, did not do that. He was the bad guy. He actually made them stop the temple, which we'll get into in just a little bit. Yeah, Cambyses was a bad guy. Darius the First loved the Jews. He was actually, we'll learn that he's going to be friends with the governor, and he was a good guy, and he actually helped to finance it. We'll learn something kind of funny. This guy's going to do something kind of cool to the bad people around Israel. But Xerxes is the guy who married Esther in the book of Esther. So when you see Esther married Xerxes, if you remember the story, Esther, it's the only time that God's not mentioned in the Bible, but basically she helped save the Jews while in Babylon. So I recommend you reading it. It's kind of good. It's a good story. Artaxerxes allowed the second and third. So Artaxerxes is really where Ezra and Nehemiah came from. He was the guy who allowed Ezra and Nehemiah to come back. All right, let's learn about a couple of the guys that you're going to read in these books. Zerubbabel, the governor, and Joshua, the high priest. So Zerubbabel was the guy who led those people back. Now, you got to think when I say lead back, they didn't lead like 10 people back, 100 people. He led 45,000 people. 45,000 people. But let me tell you, that wasn't all the people there. More than half of them stayed. So not only were they taken to Babylon, they stayed. A lot of them didn't come back. And actually, that's why we're going to find that there were actually 3 returns. So he took in 538, he came back. Joshua was the first high priest, and he was when the Jews returned, and he helped rebuild the temple in 516. Now, when you read the book of Zechariah and the book of Haggai, they will talk almost exclusively about these 2 guys. That's why I want you to know about them. Because those books pretty much talk about them a lot. All right, Ezra was a priest and a scribe. Okay, so what is a scribe? A scribe is a dude that actually writes the Bible. So if you're going to copy a manuscript, we didn't have, copy machines. It doesn't have that back then. What we had is this guy. He would sit and write word for word. Now, these guys would become the Pharisees. We'll get into that later, but that's who those guys would become. But he's a priest, so which is unusual, because priests and scribes usually are a little bit different. They usually don't always mix together. Nehemiah was the cupbearer of the king. What does that mean? Well, a cupbearer basically, so that was a very highly coveted position. It was a dangerous position because, my queen here, she wants to drink her wine or whatever, and so she gives it to me first and said, you drink it first. If you die, I'm okay. Seriously, that's what the cupbearer did. So she was like, yeah, John, you hear it. No, you drink it, John. No, you drink it. You drink it. Oh, you drink it. I'm not gonna drink that. Let's get Mikey. Anyway, so Nehemiah was the cupbearer of the king, and he actually helped come back to build the walls, which we'll get into. So these guys, Nehemiah really wasn't a priest or a scribe, but he had a high position, which the king actually allowed him to come back. Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi. Zechariah had a series of visions to encourage Joshua and Zerubbabel. So when you read this book and it says, take heed, Joshua, take heed, Zerubbabel, that's who they're talking about. Zerubbabel the governor, Joshua the high priest. So Haggai also did the same thing as Zechariah did. And Malachi was there about almost 100 years later. He actually got there. They say about 440, 430, something like that. Some say 420, I don't know, whatever. He's around that time. All right, this is the coffee guy. He's a wonderful resource because he wrote a lot of stuff. And he helped us to understand the little bits and pieces. So what I recommend, if you want to read Josephus, it goes on and on and on and on. He writes a lot. But you know what? What you want to do is do what I do, is you'll pick out the point of where he wrote compared to what you're reading in the Bible, and he will fill in the gaps. So-and-so, because remember we talked about when during the Babylonian exile that they threw the king over the wall? Well, that's not in the Bible. That's actually from Josephus. So what you do is if you want to really work parallel with those books, you're going to read Josephus, and then you're going to read the Bible at the same section of the Bible, and he will actually talk about the very same thing. So it's kind of interesting. The Cyrus cylinder, I figured I'd throw this in there because one of the interesting things is Cyrus was very famous for his governing style. Well, yeah, because he's not flaying people's skin and sticking them on poles. He's not doing that anymore. These guys actually had a good governing style. And what's interesting, what God blessed him with, is not only how he beat the Babylonians, right? But the thing is, he walked into Babylon. He didn't just fight his way into Babylon. He walked into Babylon, a complete city, and able to set up his shop and do everything there, and able to take care of these guys. So it happened much quicker. So you see, God was actually involved with that because God made it easier for the Jews to leave. If he would have had to fight for the city, guess how many Jews probably would have died? A lot, because they would have been fight for them. But It didn't happen that way. Literally just walked right in. All right, let's go over what happened, and let's hear what Josephus had to say about Cyrus. Now, interesting, he goes into actually a lot of detail about Cyrus, and I'm only picking bits and pieces of this. So we're not going to, and we're not quite there yet. But I did give reference to the parts in his book where he talks about this. But one other thing I want to tell you about is that King Darius the Mede you read in Daniel is not the same King Darius we're going to be talking about here. Okay, King Darius the Mede. Some say they think he was Cyrus, but I don't know. I have no idea. But he was not the same guy as King Darius we're going to see. So because King Darius here was Persian, not Median. And that's why I put Media in there earlier, because you guys understand that they're two very distinct places. So when you read that they're actually talking about some guy from the Medes. All right. According to Josephus, what Cyrus did is he read Isaiah. Remember we just talked about that 140 years before? According to Josephus, what happened was Cyrus, when Cyrus came in, the high priest came up and gave him the law and said, look, read. God talks about you. How would you like that? Mary, you don't know me, but God's been talking about you for a long time, and it was written 140 years ago, and here you are. This is what it says about you. I mean, that's exactly what it is. So according to Josephus, the high priest came up there and said, he read Isaiah, and that's what caused him. I mean, got to understand, that's weird. How many times would someone say, okay, you can go back to your people, and by the way, here's a bunch of money to go back with. He gave them money. He gave them some of the artifacts from the temple to go back with. You think kings want to get rid of their gold? I don't think so. But that's what happened, according to Josephus. So, however, something changed a little bit. All of a sudden, we've got these people coming back, and they start building the temple, and then we have Cambyses coming. But by the end of Cyrus's reign, Cyrus actually had a big problem in Egypt. Imagine that. Everybody has a problem with Egypt. So he had a big problem fighting them, and so he got busy, then he got killed. Cyrus was killed. And then Cambyses came in here. Well, what happened is our buddies, the Sumerians, were not happy because the thing is, Sumerians, when the Jews left, who do you think moved into their cities? Uh-oh, ouch. You wonder why they didn't like these people when you get to the New Testament, why the Sumerians are hated so much? That's why. But it gets worse than this. So they had to move because Jews came back. So Sumerians were not happy. But so what they did is they sent a letter to Cambyses and lied to him and said, the Jews aren't paying their taxes. They're building walls. They're not building a temple, which is not true. Actually, we know that's not true because we know that's one of the reasons why Nehemiah came back 80 years later, was to build the walls, because they weren't built. So what they were saying was a lie. And so Cambyses said, okay, that's it. Enough of that. No more temple building. They couldn't build their temple for 10 years. So Josephus gives information. Now, the interesting thing is they had to stop building the temple for 10 years. But when Josephus died, Darius the first took over. Now, interestingly enough, Josephus tells us that Darius was friends with Zerubbabel. They grew up together before Darius was king. He knew Zerubbabel. And they have this it's a huge amount of information about all this stuff. I didn't go into it, but they were buddies, and God blessed, what he was saying, that God blessed Zerubbabel with wisdom and understanding, blah, blah, blah. And so what he did is he basically went back to Darius and said, hey, what's up, man? See, Cyrus said we can build this. Why can't we continue it? Remember, this is 10 years later. This is 10 years later. So so according to Josephus, what Darius did, Darius went, and actually Ezra speaks of this also in his book, that Darius went back and read about it and said, hey, you're right. He did say that. So what he did is he said, all right, let's get going. And not only that, he said, okay, not only am I going to give you some money, but all these dudes around you are going to give him money too. By the way, all you dudes around him, give him money. So he made the Sumerians pay for the temple. Ouch. And what they tried to do is they went to him and said, hey, the Sumerians, this is in Ezra, hey, we want to build the temple. We want to do this. We want this to happen. Come build the temple with us. We'll be helpers with you. And they're like, I don't blame them. I wouldn't trust them either. They had him stop, they had him lie, they went to the governor, they did all this. It's almost like the guy who goes and tells the teacher something on you and you didn't do anything wrong. So, all right, so now we're back to building the temple. In Zechariah, they talked about, proclaiming, build the temple and let it happen. Go for it. So let's stop a second and think about what the Jews went through this. They came back, had money, had artifacts, and started building the temple. Then they had to stop for 10 years. So not only that, but Ezra talked about that the Sumerians bribed the guards who were actually from Persia to make things stop. Man, these were terrible people. And so you wonder why the Sumerians were hated so much. Look at what they did. Yes, ma'am.
In this presentation on the Sumerians and the Sumerians?
No. Yeah, remember the Sumerians actually were around the time of Abraham, which was about 2100 BC. Yeah, this is like 530 BC. Yeah, they were long gone, but good question. Good question, because the Sumerians were guys from Ur in Mesopotamia, so way down south. So, and these guys are the Sumerians from their Samaria.
So the Sumerians lied and the Sumerians had to pay.
Right. Yep, Sumerians lied. The Sumerians bribed the guards. The Sumerians took over their towns when they left. And you wonder when you see the Sumerians, why the Jews, you'll find even in the Gospels, they went around Samaria. They didn't want to go through it because they hated these people. Well, now we know why. Amazing what you learn in the Old Testament, huh? All right, temple was finally built in 516 BC. That's a pretty famous year. And would remain there for 586 years. The second temple lasted 586 till 70 AD. We will get into that when we get to the when we get to the intertestamental and also church history. But the problem is, the thing is, problems just really didn't end there, though. There was some more problems that happened, because you think they come back, things are going good, they're sacrificing, they're doing all their stuff, things are good. Well, not really. So, let's go back to Ezra and Nehemiah for a minute. Second and third waves, so we talk about probably another, it was like around 25,000 or so a piece. Ezra led in, and Nehemiah led about 25,000 piece. So over a 93-year time frame, they led 100,000 people. Now, it wasn't jump in the buses, close the door, and let's drive you in there. These guys had to walk. And it wasn't, they walked through the desert. Now, I went to college in New Mexico. Let me tell you, it's not fun. They had to walk through the desert. We're talking like 500 miles. And there were 45,000, 25,000 a piece each time. Ezra returned in 458, Nehemiah in 444, and the temple was completed. Ezra first became the governor. So Ezra was governor and tried to get some stuff straight. Okay, Nehemiah then came in 14 years later, and he became governor. But the thing is, what we're going to find out is these Sumerians were getting frisky again. They're getting they're getting crazy again. So here we go. 58 years later, they're back to their craziness again. So what happened was what Nehemiah did, so Ezra came in, and Ezra's really big claim to fame. Really, he was governor, he led 25,000 people, but he also wrote Chronicles and Ezra. So Nehemiah comes in, and what Nehemiah did, and this is in the book of Ezra, he went to the governor, he went to the king and said, "Hey, king, by the way, here, let me try, no, me first." Okay, no. So he goes to go, "Hey, you know what? The walls of the city are not built. Remember what the Sumerians tried to lie, said they were trying to build the walls and not the temple? Well, this is a lie because we know from these books that the walls were not built." And so what he did is he went back, and I'm sure, so I mean, you know they had good relationships with Darius and stuff. Why couldn't they build the walls? Most likely the Sumerians were getting frisky again and saying, we're going to let you do that. And you'll read actually in Nehemiah how they had a sword in one hand and a hammer in the other. So they were fighting and building the walls at the same time. So what happened was that these guys, Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs, basically, I believe some of these guys were Sumerian and the other guys were Ammonites. Remember, Ammonites were their cousins. They were very angry. They plotted against them. So even in Nehemiah, when they were trying to build the walls, there were problems. All right, let's talk about Ezra and Nehemiah mixed marriages. Now, let's not go with the world. The world wants to try to judge this and say, these guys are prejudiced. No, it had nothing to do with prejudice. What they talked about, and you'll see this in both Ezra and Nehemiah, the big problem Judah had was they continued to marry the people out around them, from the people around them. Remember, they weren't supposed to do that, and the reason why they weren't supposed to do that is all you got to do is read about Solomon, and it'll cure you of that thought. Oh yeah, no, I know why good there. I know why God said not to do that. Because when you marry these people, what do they inevitably do? Look, come on over here. Let me let you meet my God. Hey, this is my God here. That's exactly what they did. Yep. And so when they talked about mixed marriages, basically what was happening, and I'll tell you, if you want to read even a better story, go to Numbers, right before they went into the land, how the Ammonites and those guys came in there and gave them all their women and said, hey, because they wanted to curse them. Seriously. So the reason why was because God says, don't be unequally yoked. All right, that's a New Testament phrase. I'm sorry, I did throw that in there. But don't be unequally yoked with someone outside the faith. And so, but remember, they went to captivity because of this kind of stuff. They got hauled away. Their temple was destroyed. Their city was destroyed. Everything was destroyed. I would be freaking out too if I was Ezra and Nehemiah saying, you guys got to stop marrying those women. They're turning your heart away from them. That's what they're talking about. So, because what it was doing is it made them synchronistic. Meaning they worship more than one God. So God plus. And I think about that a lot. Do I have God plus in my life? I was thinking about that this morning. What other God am I worshiping? Am I looking only to God, or am I looking to someone else along with him? All right. So, like I said, Ezra 9 and 10, he actually lists the people. He says, these people did it. How would you like to have your name in history forever and ever? Millions of people read how that you had these wives out there. He actually lists their names. And it actually helped. They actually did turn back and everything, at least for a little while. All right, now let's finish up with Malachi. Malachi is the 12th of the minor prophets. He was the last guy in the Bible. Basically, he was about 76 years after the temple built, and there were some bad habits. Let's go over those. Remember, the law said, when you bring a sacrifice to God, make sure it's good sacrifice, not blemished, not all spots and all lame and all nasty. God wants a perfect sacrifice. Well, that's not what they were doing. That's not what they were doing. They were bringing junk. But the worst thing was, it's kind of like in our courts, it's like they allow some of these defenses and stuff, and judges allow, and you have to say to the judge, well, dude, you're the problem. You're allowing this stuff. Well, these guys, the priests, were actually allowing it. They're, okay, we'll take it. Oh, yeah, all right, that's fine, we'll take it. You know, that's not what you're supposed to do. The other thing they did is the priests were really the lawgivers. Those guys were the judges. And so they were impartial. They accepted bribes. I mean, it sounds like today. Our judges, accepted bribes. They were partial, and that is a big issue. They accepted bribes. So, the other thing is they didn't tithe. The thing about tithes, we got to understand, the thing about tithes, I came from a charismatic background, and I saw some terrible, terrible, terrible abuses of that. When these guys when these preachers, pastors, what do you want to call them, are driving $500,000 vehicles, and the people are poorer than dirt in your church, there's a problem. But the thing is, what they were doing here was they were saying that you're robbing God. Why were they robbing God? Because the priests had to eat. The people in our church, Jeff and Isaac and those guys, they're here to minister to us. But if we're not giving to them, we're robbing God, because we're robbing God from allowing ministry of them to go to others. Now, I would say I love this church, because this church, they just have some of the best when it comes to offerings and givings. Man, I remember how I would sit, and I always remember one time the guy says, the angels are walking up and down the aisles, looking how much your checks you're writing, how much money you're giving to God. I mean, it was craziness. I mean, and they would say it for 20 minutes and tell you how, that was awful. Now, I know that's not, so I'm not even going to go any farther than that. All right. Tithes and offerings, he said. All right, so, Robbie, can you play that?
That's all, folks. You're welcome.
That I'll say. That I'll say.
I'll say, son.
What do I say, Carol?
And that's the end.
That's all what? What are folks? He's crazy.
What are folks?
That's all, folks. Oh, I'm sorry, after you. No, not at all, after you. I insist after you. Oh, no, after you. After you, after you, after you, after you, after you.
So this is it, guys. This is the last one. And so what I want you guys to know is this. I really appreciate it. Next week, we're going to have a review. Please come. Please come. Study. Maybe you might want to study
On a
before you come
final
there.
note,
We'll have a review.
kids, don't
and
forget
we'll go
to
through
eat
some
your
things,
broccoli.
And then we're going to
It's
go.
good for you.
You are amazing. Look at that. He did this last night.
That's
I know for a fact because I emailed him about 6 o'clock yesterday.
I
Asked
shouldn't
me.
have those
So
artichoke
that is our man up here. Our man.
Hasta
Yay! Great job.
Well, that's
All right, is there any
awesome.
questions? Okay, so no questions, because next week bring your questions, because that's what we're going to be doing.
Can I interest you in a muffin? I ate half of it. It's not very
All right,
good.
guys, thanks so much.